Good morning, everyone. My name is Donna Pollard, and I am the president and founder of Survivors Corner. We are a grassroots nonprofit that provides empowerment to adult survivors of various forms of trauma. And we really connect them with reframing their trauma into purpose that's going to be protective in the communities. I'm really honored that JD reached out and asked me to share my experience with you all today because I really believe that I'm a living example of a person that went through horrendous circumstances and was able to transform that into something that would ultimately benefit the kids here in Kentucky, and that is the end of child marriage through parental consent. My personal journey began when I was a child. My mother was very abusive. She certainly had some mental health challenges herself that were never treated or diagnosed. And so that ended up causing her to take a lot of her frustrations out on me and not have the coping skills to deal with those as an adult herself. And so I grew up in this house where, I was beaten with a belt and I was ridiculed for being overweight and, just a lot of abuse psychologically and physically. And then when I was 12, my father was diagnosed with advanced stage lung cancer. I had not really been close to him growing up because he was a long distance truck driver after he retired from the Army. So when he would be home, it would typically be on weekends. And yet I did feel closer to him than I did my mother, despite the fact that I was actually around her more often because my dad would do things like spend time with me playing checkers or, watching movies on TV or what have you. Um, so it was really devastating for me when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer when I was just 12. They gave him 6 months to live at that point, and he ended up living for 8 months. And when I was 13, he ultimately passed away. And that's when, my behavior just got completely out of control. I did not have any coping skills to deal with all of the things that I was going through. And, my mother certainly was not in the state to try to nurture a child through the loss of her father. And so I began acting out in a lot of self destructive ways that ended up resulting in me being admitted to Charter Behavioral Health in Jeffersonville, Indiana, when I was 14. And, when we think about mental health facilities, we think about, people getting the help that they really need and not about them being preyed upon by staff that work at the facility. But unfortunately, in my case, that's exactly what happened. I was 14 years old when I was admitted there, and there was a 29-year-old man who was a mental health technician that worked there at the facility, and he started grooming me. And, I thought at that age, especially having just lost my father, I thought, wow, this older man is giving me attention. Maybe there's something special about me. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm getting attention and like I'm getting love. And so I fell into his entrapment. And when I was released from Charter, my mother allowed me to have a dating relationship with him. And that continued for a couple of years until I turned 16. And at that time, my mother consented to me marrying him. And he was nearly 31 at the time. So when I married him, just a few weeks after my 16th birthday, I ended up dropping out of high school. So I didn't even complete the 10th grade. And, despite the challenges that I had had at home, I had always been a good student up until that point. And so much so that I was awarded a Governor's Scholarship Award in 8th grade for writing achievement, where I was in competition with other students across the state. So I got this really substantial scholarship that I was looking forward to using, but when I dropped out of school before completing the 10th grade, I lost that scholarship. So that was really devastating as well. And I quickly learned that just because I was married underage, that did not mean that I had the legal rights of an adult. When I tried to enroll myself in Clarksville High School, which Clarksville, Indiana is where we ended up moving to right after we married, and they turned me away, saying that, it would only be a matter of time before I would become pregnant, and they just couldn't have that at their school. So, basically, I was trapped with no rights and complete dependency on him. I did start working full time at a grocery store, making minimum wage, and he controlled all of it. Um, he would become very manipulative when I would not do things that he wanted me to do. Um, he was very abusive as well. There was one time that he staged a suicide attempt because the night before I had gone out to Texas Roadhouse with a few friends after work, and one of my coworkers bought my meal because I couldn't afford to pay for my own dinner, and he thought it was ridiculous that I was sitting there just eating peanuts and drinking water. And when I got home, I told who I now call my perpetrator, about that instance, and he became very belligerent about it. And then the next day, when I came home on my lunch break, he had drank half a bottle of Southern Comfort and scattered a bottle of Tylenol PM across the bathroom floor. And, at that time, being 16, I was thinking, oh my gosh, what have I done to him? And now at 36, I realize, oh my gosh, that was as manipulative as it can possibly get. The man was staging a suicide attempt to manipulate me into never again doing anything that was going to cause him pain or that went against whatever his wishes were. So that's just one example of the horrendousness that I experienced in those days of my youth. And ultimately, he began exploiting me sexually, and he had me working in a strip club. And of course, that ruined all credibility that, I would have had. So at the time that I was finally able to get away from him, I had basically no self esteem at all. Here I was, a high school dropout. I had worked in a strip club. My only work experience aside from that was really working at a grocery store or Kmart. And, both places I had worked minimum wage. And plus, my self esteem had just been completely crushed because, all the abuse that I suffered growing up, and then combined with all the abuse and manipulation I suffered from him, I felt like my only value was my ability to please other people. And so when I did escape, it really became more about what am I going to do to become the polar opposite of everything that I've been through. And so that's when I ended up getting my GED, and I put myself through college. I started working for a corporation as a temp initially, and just to get my foot through the door. And I thought that, I was really rolling in the money at that time because when I started off as a temp, I was making $10 an hour, which was a huge increase from anything that I had made aside from working in the club. But, that was something I did not want for myself. And so when I started working for this corporation, they provided me with the opportunity to go to college and do classes on site after my work hours. And so I took advantage of that. And I ended up getting my bachelor's in business with a minor in human resources. And, I ended up getting promotion after promotion working there. So having started off as a temp, by the time that I ended my career there, I had 13 years in and had ultimately been promoted to a client service manager position, which was huge for me considering everything that I started with. And so I went from being destitute financially to making, a very stable salary and having benefits. But regardless of all of those accomplishments, it was never enough, because what I realized a few years ago is that I had created all of this distance between where I started and where I had ended up without any acknowledgement of the impact that that trauma had on my life. And I realized that if I was ever going to fully heal, then I had to own the things that had happened. I had to embrace my authenticity, and I had to let go of the shame that was not even mine to carry in the first place. And the way that I began going about that was to start connecting with organizations that I knew were doing great volunteer work and really making a difference in the community, and seeing how I could get involved. And when I started talking about child marriage and realized that I wasn't alone, I had connected with the Tahereh Justice Center out of Washington, D.C., and realized that they were working on a campaign to end child marriage through parental consent across the nation. And, through this project, they had started pulling statistics in multiple states, and some of the statistics were just nauseating to me, quite honestly. And they hadn't even gotten to the state of Kentucky yet. So, upon realizing that I wasn't alone and we had to change this for the future of our generations to come, I realized that it was time for me to begin speaking my truth. And so, in partnership with the Tahereh Justice Center, we pulled the data on the state of Kentucky and realized that over 10,000 cases of child marriage had occurred since the year 2000. And prior to the change that happened back in 2018, when we were advocating for the legislation that put an end to child marriage through parental consent, the way that the laws used to work were that if you were 16 or 17, you could marry with parental consent, no questions asked. So, if a county court clerk thought that there was a predatory situation between a much older man and a younger girl, they had no authority to intervene. If the parent was consenting, they had to let that marriage go through. And under the age of 16, there was a pregnancy exception, meaning that if a child under 16 was pregnant, then if a judge would sign off on the marriage, then that marriage could occur. And I know we hear that and we think, oh gosh, no judge in their right mind would allow a child to marry a predator. But when we pulled the data from the state of Kentucky, we realized that a 13-year-old girl was married off to a 33-year-old man. And there had been numerous other cases of 14, 15-year-old girls being married off to men that were 2 and 3 times their senior. Obviously predatory situations. And, the fact that child marriage was even legal through this judicial loophole was a complete paradox and hypocritical, because that pregnancy itself was evidence of rape. So, whatever shame I had been carrying and whatever embarrassment I had been carrying from those early stages of my life, upon hearing all of that, I had to let that go, because this movement and the safety of our community is much more important than, anything that I would worry that somebody would think about me, or even what I had been internalized to think about myself. I had to let all of that go and realize that, the power that I possessed to contribute to our society in a productive way was far more important than worrying about somebody else's opinion of me. So I started speaking out about my experience. I owned it all. I've talked about the ins and outs of the exploitation that I've been through, and I forgave myself, and realized again that all of that atrocity, that's not who defines who I am. And by doing so, we were able to find a sponsor for the legislation. Senate Bill 48 ended up being passed in the 2018 Assembly. Senator Julie Rocky Adams sponsored the bill, and we put an end to child marriage through parental consent. So now we have a floor established at the age of 17, and we give very clear criteria that a judge would have to assess before they could authorize a marriage to occur. And part of that criteria is making sure that the person that the minor may be marrying is not greater than 4 years their senior. The 17-year-old would have to demonstrate that they had already either graduated high school or obtained their GED. And, there are various other safety parameters in place that would really make sure that that 17-year-old would be on equal footing legally if the marriage did occur and if the judge would authorize it. We also make emancipation simultaneous with the granting of the marriage license. So, that 17-year-old could walk out of that courtroom with all of the enumerated rights of an adult, with some exceptions, of course. They could not vote, they could not buy a pack of cigarettes, but, they at least would be able to enter into a contract and attain housing. That's one thing I don't think I mentioned earlier on. That was one of my hurdles. When things got really bad, I tried to leave my perpetrator and go to a domestic violence shelter, and they turned me away because I wasn't yet 18. I also tried to rent apartments on my own, and I was turned away by a couple of different apartment complexes because they said I could not enter into a contract with them. So, again, my lived experiences, my lived challenges and obstacles ended up being carved into this legislation that would protect other children from going through what I did. So talk about reframing your trauma into purpose. That's how I chose to turn around my life, not only for myself, but for other kids in our state. One last thought I'll leave you with is that I know a lot of people have said, well, why not push for the age of 18, which would really be the ultimate protection? And I agree. And, as advocates, we're going across the nation trying to improve the child marriage laws right now because, unfortunately, what we're hearing from a lot of state legislatures, which happened in Kentucky, was that an age 18 is not currently achievable with our political landscapes. And, as heart-wrenching as that is, I can't feel right about not making any progress, knowing that in several states still, there are 12, 13-year-old girls that could very easily and are being married off to predators who then not only have access to continue exploiting them, but also their children. So I would much rather push forward with something that's progressive than not do anything at all, knowing that ultimately we will circle back and we will achieve an age 18 bright line in all states across the country. But in the meantime, we have to be making some progress at least. I will also share that the state of Indiana just adopted our legislation as well. So they are the 8th state, actually. We have had a lot of success in legislation that we helped to write with the Tahirih Justice Center, who has been phenomenal about the groundwork. And so our legislation has been utilized as something that they have been, that other states have been looking to model in multiple areas, with the state of Indiana being the most recent. So we're going to keep charging forward until no other child is subjected to this trauma. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, especially as we're all social distancing. It's really great to have a way to be connected. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, so please feel free to submit your comments to me. And thank you so much for your incredible work. I know, the social work realm is definitely one of the most challenging careers, but it can be the most rewarding as well, knowing that you have the ability to make a difference in other people's lives. The very last thought I'll leave you with is be authentic and own your truth, because regardless of what you may have encountered in your life, you absolutely can reframe any circumstance into something that will be of service to our communities. That's what we're all about at Survivors Corner, and that's what I try to take into my day-to-day life as well. So I hope that you will find encouragement in that, and I hope that you will join me in trying to continue using our personal experiences to make this world a safer and more empowered place. Thank you all so much. You have a great day.